Great. Well, thank you very much. I've learned so much sitting in on all of the presentations today, and we're going to pivot to away from lichens and mosses and talk about beads. As Megan said, I'm Allison Carter. I'm at the University of Oregon, and I'm presenting this on behalf of a collaborative project with Megan at Fort Vancouver and also my colleague Laura Disabue at the Field Museum in Chicago. And I realized after I sent in these slides that I did not acknowledge our funding source. So I also want to mention the RACO grant for glass research from the Corning Museum of Glass, which is helping support this research. Okay, next slide. So we are working on materials from the site of Fort Vancouver in Washington, which is a National Historic Site that's located along the Columbia River. In Vancouver, Washington, you can see its location here on this black and white map. It was established in 1825 as part of the Hudson's Bay Company, and it is on the traditional homelands of the indigenous peoples of the Lower Columbia and was a place used for trade, travel, hunting, and gathering by indigenous peoples from around what is now Southwest Washington and Northeast Oregon. Next slide, please. So Fort Vancouver was the administrative headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company's operations in Western North America. And archaeologist Douglas Wilson noted that it controlled the fur business from, quote, Russian Alaska to Mexican California and from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, a territory of about 700,000 square miles, unquote. So the site, the Fort Vancouver site, was the major supplier of European goods to the region from about 1825 to about 1850. And the image here you can see is a black and white drawing of the Fort Vancouver site as it appeared in 1833. Next slide. So there's been several excavations at the Fort Vancouver site, and from these excavations, over 100,000 glass beads have been identified. And these were a key item that were being traded from Fort Vancouver across what is now British Columbia, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And some scholars have even proposed that these beads were coming into California and Alaska as well. So from these excavations with over 100,000 beads, over 150 different types of beads have been identified. These were initially studied and classified by Lester Ross and then revised and updated by Robert Cromwell, Flynn Renard, and Elaine Dorset, and very handily published in this guidebook that you can see the cover of here that was published by the Fort Vancouver Museum in 2013. And I'll just note that this is available as a free PDF download from the National Park Service website at the URL listed here. And it's a really helpful reference for identifying the bead types at the fort, but also the other kinds of beads that we might be seeing in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. So the current project's aim is to build on this foundational work by undertaking compositional analysis of these different bead types from that guidebook. And the method that we're using is known as laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, or LAICPMS for short. And the benefit of this technique is that it's a wonderful technique. It's virtually non-destructive. It uses a laser of about 60 microns in size, which is about the width of a human hair. And it samples the glass, and then from there it can measure the major, minor, and trace elements, and it only leaves a very small mark on the bead that's really barely visible to the naked eye. So you can see this image in the upper left here that shows a broken yellow glass bead at 70 times magnification, and the arrow is pointing to the 4 small laser holes that were made as part of this analytical process. And then you can see in the there's the upper right-hand image, and then the lower left-hand image shows the LAICPMS lab at the Field Museum in Chicago and a student working on the machine. Next slide, please. So why do this in the first place? Well, glass beads can look really similar to one another, but have been made from different recipes that can be then associated with different workshops, places, and time periods. And so what compositional analysis does is tells us what elements were used to make the glass, and from there we can interpolate the recipe, and from there we can start to understand a little bit more about where the glass beads were coming from and understand a little bit more about the trade and exchange networks. Next slide, please. So scholars in Eastern North America have been undertaking compositional analysis of glass beads for over 40 years. However, analysis of beads from sites in the Pacific Northwest has really lagged behind this. So the goal of the current project is to send beads from this type collection at the Fort Vancouver site to the Field Museum for compositional analysis in order to build a database of bead compositions for each of the types that have been identified in that bead guide. And the primary output of this project will be a free companion resource to the Fort Vancouver bead guide that provides the composition or compositions for each bead, including analyzing different colors for polychrome beads, and then briefly describing and contextualizing the glass compositions found within this collection. And when this project is finished, the idea is that we'll also make this resource freely available on the NPS website. And here you can see a picture of some of the white opaque roundish beads that have been found at Fort Vancouver. Next slide, please. So we have from Lester Ross's previous work some ideas about where these beads might have been coming from. When he undertook his initial study in 1990, he proposed that many of the beads were European and likely coming from Venice or Bohemia, but then also suggested that China was a source as well. In 2007, Laurie Burgess from the Smithsonian and Lord Disabue from the Field Museum studied glass beads from the Sullivan's Island site along the Columbia River in Washington. And these beads were believed to have originally come from Fort Vancouver, and they identified glass recipes and bead manufacturing methods that were consistent with these locations. Next slide. So far about 2/3 of the type collection has been analyzed thus far, and we're in the process of going through all of the data. I'm finding that there's unsurprisingly some compositional and stylistic similarities with the Sullivan's Island collection. And of course, since we don't have that much time, I'll just share a few of the examples that we have found so far. Next slide, please. So the bead pictured here is a fairly common bead. It's a small drawn glass oblate bead with a white and dark blue stripes over a light blue glass core. And all three colors in this bead showed a high lead content with also high concentrations of potash and also concentrations of arsenic, which indicate that this was probably used as an opacifier for the glass. And arsenic is actually said to have been used as an opacifier in Venetian glass workshops since the early 18th century. And we also know that Venetian workshops were producing a lot of these small drawn glass beads. So together, the recipe and the manufacturing method suggest the connection to Venice for this bead. Next slide, please. We also know that there were Bohemian glass workshops, and these were largely producing mold pressed beads as well as drawn beads with facets, like the dark blue example here. This bead is sometimes called, or has sometimes been called in the past, Russian blue beads, but the name Russian is not an accurate description of their origin. This particular glass bead has high potash and high lime in its composition, which is typical of Bohemian glass manufacturing. And so together, these seem like they are probably made from a Bohemian workshop. Next slide, please. Then we have this wound blue oblate glass beads here, which are really common type found at Fort Vancouver, and Ross attributed this to Chinese manufacturing method. He thought that they were manufactured in China, but instead this particular glass type has a really similar composition to the previous glass type. And so this presents kind of a mystery because we actually know that in China, people were importing glass from Europe and then recycling it to make beads. And the wound method is fairly common in China as well, too. So we do need to do a little bit more research to be more confident that this might have been a Chinese glass wound bead. Next slide, please. So here's some more images of additional glass bead types that we're analyzing, and just to give you an idea for the diversity of the collection as well too. So we're hoping to really get a lot of compositional data for a wide variety of different glass types. Next slide, please. And this is just a small part of a larger project, like I mentioned. Our ultimate goal is to create this comprehensive guide that will then be useful to other people. That will be able to bring together all of our results and kind of make sense of this particular collection. And then also, next slide, please. What we hope is that this will be really helpful for people working in the Pacific Northwest and West Coast as well. And I have a plug-in for two of my former students who've done research on glass beads from sites in Oregon and Alaska. And they did this research before we had started this project at Fort Vancouver. But this is a great way where we think we could extend some of their work and now start comparing the collections that we have from Oregon and Alaska that are at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, and start better understanding the exchange of beads in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the 19th century. So yes, I just want to shout out my two former students, Sire Pro and Tom Tanberg, who had presented on their work at the Society for American Archaeology meetings in Portland. And next slide, please. That's all I have. I have my email address here if anyone has any questions. And thank you very much for your attention. And we look forward to, if we have another one of these next year, maybe having some more data that we can share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If you have questions, put them in the chat or raise your virtual hand and we will read them out, or you can talk if you want. While we're waiting for folks to type and get their questions, and if you have them, I will just say from Fort Vancouver, we are so excited to be a part of this project. It is really, I don't know if it's surprising, but I get a lot of visitor questions about where the beads come from, which I always find interesting, like the things that people think about and touch on to ask me about. And, we have this data, like not really data, but we have like the records from the 19th century. We have some, the archaeology that's been done here. This is really extra cool.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be part of it. And my own background is not in looking at glass beads in the Pacific Northwest, so this has been really fun for me to really dive into this this project as well. I do see a question in the chat about, was anyone making beads in the U.S.? Not to the same during this time period, I don't actually know if there were any people actively making beads to this extent. The major powerhouse was really Venice, actually, and then Bohemia and China were kind of more minor industries. But Venice was the main supplier of beads, not just in North America, but around the world during this time period.
The bead collection at Fort Vancouver really is a great sort of tangible way to talk about those trade routes that the Hudson's Bay Company brought. And this data will, as we share it, give us even more to talk about with visitors. Very cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Oh, Tessa, who's our Cultural Resources Program Manager, says, interesting work, can't wait for the results guide. Yes, absolutely. And Bob Cromwell, who was an archaeologist at Fort Vancouver, is happy to see the results. So hi, Tessa and Bob and Carly.